Picture a man who commanded armies, who could stare down cannon fire without flinching, who signed his name into the birth of a nation with a steady hand. Now picture that same man unable to eat a piece of bread without wincing, his mouth packed with metal and bone and teeth that did not come from his own body, some of them pulled from the mouths of people he owned. That's George Washington behind the closed doors of Mount Vernon, not the marble statue, not the dollar bill. A man whose breath could clear a room, whose gums bled into his handkerchief most mornings, whose comfort depended entirely on the hands of a servant nobody remembers the name of. We're going back there tonight. Not to the battlefield, not to the inauguration, to the dressing room, to the basin of grey water and the folded cloth and the tiny bone tools laid out like surgical instruments, because that's exactly what they are. One morning, one pair of hands, everything they would have touched, smelled and endured before the great man ever stepped outside to be great in front of anyone else. Your hands know this room in the dark. You don't need a candle to find the basin, the razor case, the small wooden box with the brass clasp that you open only for him and only in private. You are Caesar, and you have been the one who prepares George Washington's body for the day since you were a boy too small to lift the water jug without spilling half of it down your shirt. Nobody outside this room knows what you know. That is the arrangement, spoken and unspoken. What happens between the basin and the door stays between the basin and the door. The candle catches, and the light throws long shadows against the plastered wall. You set the water to warm, though warm is a generous word for what the kettle over these embers will produce in the next 20 minutes. Below the window, the Potomac is still black, still asleep, fog lying flat across it like a second river made of nothing. The house creaks the way it always creaks in the last hour before dawn, wood contracting after a night of cold, and somewhere down the hall a door opens. You rose an hour before this in the dark of your own small room, dressing quickly in clothes still holding the chill of the night, your breath visible for a moment even indoors before your body warmed against the effort of moving. You crossed the yard in that same darkness, boots crunching against frost-stiffened grass, past the kitchen where the cook was already coaxing the banked embers back into flame, up the back stairs whose 13th step you know to avoid because it groans loud enough to wake the whole east wing if you're careless with your weight on it. This is the part of the morning no one accounts for, the hour before the hour anyone notices, the quiet, unwitnessed labour of simply arriving, ready, before the man you serve has even opened his eyes. He is already awake. He is always already awake. You have never once in all your years at this task beaten him to consciousness. The man who cannot sleep past 4 in the morning, who paces his study before the household stirs, who reads dispatches by candlelight until his eyes water, walks into the dressing room in his nightshirt with his jaw already tight, already bracing. You know that look. It means the pain started again in the night. Caesar. That's all he says. That's all he needs to say. You've laid the tools out already. The small ivory-handled instruments that look like something a jeweller might use, not a valet. A hooked pick. A soft brush worn nearly bald from years of use. A tin of tooth powder that smells of chalk and something bitter underneath. Myrrh, maybe. Or something the apothecary swore would help and probably doesn't. The chair itself has grown slightly worn at the arms from years of exactly this grip. 2 pale patches in the dark wood where his hands have pressed down morning after morning, bracing against whatever the cleaning that day will demand of him. You've come to think of that chair almost as another instrument in this work, as essential in its own way as the brush or the pick. the one fixed point in a routine that otherwise shifts slightly with every passing year of decline. He sits in the chair by the window, the one with the high back, and tips his head slightly toward the grey light coming through the glass. This is the part nobody paints. Nobody puts this in the portraits. The great general, sitting still while a servant leans in close enough to smell his breath, close enough to see exactly how bad it has gotten. It has gotten bad. You've been doing this long enough to remember when he had, by your count, perhaps 8 or 9 of his own teeth left in his head. That was years ago now. This morning when he opens his mouth and you tilt the candle closer, you count 1. 1 single tooth, a lower left premolar, standing alone in a red and swollen landscape like the last tree on a burned hillside. You remember, too, the first time you ever stood in this room performing any part of this work, a boy of 9 or 10 trailing behind the older man who trained you, carrying the water jug with both arms wrapped around it, because it was too heavy for one arm alone, terrified of spilling even a drop on the good floorboards. Washington had fewer troubles with his teeth in those days, though the trouble had already begun. A slow, private decline that would occupy the better part of your working life once you were old enough to be trusted with it directly. You did not understand as a boy what you were being trained toward. You only understood that this room mattered more than most rooms in the house, that whatever happened inside it needed to stay inside it, and that the old valet's hands guiding yours through your first clumsy attempts at cleaning a mouth not your own, moved with a patience you did not yet possess but would, eventually, learn to carry the same way he carried it. The rest is metal, bone, wire, and the teeth of other people. You don't let your face show what you're thinking. You never let your face show what you're thinking. That's the first rule of this room, the rule nobody ever spoke aloud to you, but that you learned the way you learned everything else here, by watching what happened to people who forgot it. It's swollen again, sir, you say, keeping your voice flat and useful. The lower left side. I know it's swollen. His voice comes out thick, careful, the way it always does in the morning before the dentures go in, before he remembers to shape his words around the gaps. Without his teeth, without the wired contraption that fills his mouth during the day, his face looks different. Sunken slightly at the jaw. Older than 57. Older than the paintings will ever admit. You reach for the small cloth, and the bowl of the astringent wash the doctor left. A mixture of vinegar and something herbal that stings when it touches broken skin, which it does every single morning, because there is always broken skin in there now. This will hurt, sir. It always does. You dip the cloth, you lean in, and you begin the part of the job that nobody who admires this man from a distance would ever want to see up close. Cleaning the mouth of George Washington tooth by tooth, gap by gap, each one a small monument to failure and pain and money spent chasing a solution that has never quite arrived. The smell hits you first, the way it always does. Not the fresh mint smell of modern imagination. Nothing like that. This is something closer to rot mixed with metal. A thick organic decay note underneath the astringent tang of the vinegar wash, and beneath that, faint but unmistakable, the smell of infection that never fully clears because nothing here ever fully heals. You've grown almost used to it after all these years, the way you grow used to any smell you're forced to live inside of. But this morning it's worse than usual, and worse means you have to be more careful, not less. Your fingers work the small brush along what remains of his gum line. He grips the arms of the chair. Neither of you speaks. This is a kind of intimacy that has no name, this daily ritual of pain management performed by a man who is not free. upon the body of a man who owns him, both of them bound by the same unbreakable arrangement of the house, the war, the century. The lower plate, he manages, feels wrong against the swelling. You already know. You fitted that plate yourself 3 years back now. Watch the dentist named Greenwood carve the base from hippopotamus ivory, imported at extraordinary expense, because human dentures made from wood alone splinter and stain, and taste, within weeks, of everything the mouth has eaten since they were carved. Hippopotamus ivory holds up better. It's porous still. It absorbs the wine and the coffee and the tobacco smoke. It darkens over months into something the colour of old piano keys, but it holds its shape mostly, and it doesn't crack the way human bone dentures crack under the pressure of a jaw clenched too many nights from pain. Set into that ivory base, held with tiny gold rivets and lengths of springy brass wire, are teeth. Real teeth. Human teeth. Pulled from human mouths, because in this century that is simply how dentures are made. There is no other way. No factory somewhere producing porcelain substitutes that anyone can afford. If you want teeth that look and function like teeth, you need actual teeth. And actual teeth come from actual people, usually poor people, usually people desperate enough to sell what's in their mouths for a fraction of what a wealthy man will pay, to put those same teeth back into use. Some of those teeth, you happen to know, because you were there when the ledger entry was made, came from the mouths of enslaved people on this very plantation. 9 teeth, the account book says, purchased for a sum that would not buy George Washington a single decent coat, taken from people who had no real choice in the matter, no real payment beyond what was recorded as payment, stitched now permanently into the mouth of the man they call the father of this country. You know this because your hands have cleaned this denture more times than you can count. You know the shape of each tooth in that plate, the way you know the grain of the wood on the banister you dust every week. You've never said a single word about it to anyone. Not to Washington, not to your wife, not even, most nights, to yourself. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry out loud. You carry it silent, the way you carry the water jug, the way you carry the whole weight of this house on your back every single morning before the sun is even fully up. You know too, though this knowledge sits even heavier than the ledger entry, which particular people those 9 teeth most likely came from, because you were a grown man already, working in this same house the year the transaction happened, and you remember the small commotion it caused below stairs, the way certain of the younger men and women on the property went quiet for days afterward, touching their own jaws absently in a gesture you recognized even then as something between grief and fear. You do not know, cannot know, whether any specific tooth resting in that ivory plate came from a mouth you've spoken to, laughed with, sat beside at some rare Sunday gathering when the work allowed for it. You've decided over the years that you do not want to know that specific answer, because knowing it would make the morning cleaning unbearable in a way that not knowing it somehow does not. There is a particular moment, every few months, when you catch yourself studying the shape of a tooth in that plate a little too long, turning the small brush slowly rather than efficiently, and you have to force your hands back into their practiced rhythm. Force your mind back into the flat, useful blankness that lets you do this work at all. You think sometimes that this blankness is its own kind of skill, harder one than the actual cleaning and fitting, a discipline of the mind every bit as demanding as the discipline of the hands, and you have never once seen it acknowledged as a skill by anyone who benefits from your having mastered it. There, you say, when the cleaning is done and the mouth is as clear as it's going to get, I'll fetch the plates. The wooden box with the brass clasp sits on the dressing table, and inside it, nested in a lining of soft cloth, are the dentures themselves. Upper and lower, curved pieces of ivory and metal and other people's teeth, soaking overnight in a small dish of water, because dry ivory cracks. Dry ivory splits down the middle at the worst possible moment, during a dinner with foreign dignitaries, during a speech to Congress, and there is nothing more dangerous to a man's authority than his own mouth falling apart in front of witnesses. You unlatch the wooden box, the small brass clasp cold and slightly stiff under your thumb this early in the morning, and the smell that rises from inside it, wet ivory and standing water and the faint mineral tang of the metal springs, is a smell you have long since stopped noticing except on mornings like this one, when everything else about his mouth has already put you on edge, and every sense seems sharpened past its usual dullness. You lift the lower plate first, water dripping from it, cold against your fingers, heavier than it looks. The brass spring mechanism connecting the upper and lower plates catches the candlelight. Two curved bars of metal that will sit against his gums and force his jaw into a permanent faint clench for the rest of the day. A tension that never quite releases, that shows in the set of his mouth in every portrait ever painted of him, that famous tight-lipped expression people call dignified restraint. It isn't restraint, it's engineering. It's a metal spring holding his face together. "Open, sir!" Before any of that, though, there is the matter of the stains, because the ivory does not stay pale for long, and you have learned, through long trial and long error, exactly which substances darken it fastest, and exactly what to do about the darkening once it happens. Coffee is the worst offender, worse even than the red wine he takes most evenings with dinner, worse than the tobacco smoke that drifts through his study some afternoons when a particular kind of business conversation seems to call for a pipe. The porous ivory drinks in whatever passes over it, holding the colour deep in its grain the way a wooden cutting board holds the colour of beets long after the beets themselves are gone, and no amount of scrubbing with the tooth powder in the morning fully lifts what's soaked in the night before. You've developed your own private method for slowing the staining, a mixture you settled on after years of experimenting quietly, without ever telling the doctor or anyone else, because you suspect the doctor would disapprove of a servant improvising remedies not written in any medical text he trusts. A little salt, a little chalk scraped fine, worked in with the brush at a particular angle along the grain of the ivory rather than against it, followed by a rinse of water just short of boiling, which seems, though you cannot say precisely why, to lift more of yesterday's darkness than cold water manages on its own. It is not a full solution. Nothing is a full solution. By midday, if you hold the lower plate up to the window light, you can already see the faint amber tint beginning to return along the biting edge, and by evening, before the final cleaning, the whole plate has taken on a colour closer to old piano keys than to anything you would call white. He opens what he can. You fit the lower plate first, easing it along the swollen gum, watching his jaw tighten involuntarily at the contact. Then the upper. The spring mechanism clicks faintly into place, a sound so small you'd never hear it if you weren't listening for it every single morning of your working life, and his face changes in an instant, fills out, becomes the face that will greet visitors and generals and his own wife within the hour. The transformation is almost frightening in how complete it is. One moment, a sunken, older, private face. The next, the public face, structured by wire and bone and the teeth of the dispossessed ready to be looked at. "Better," he says, though you can hear the strain underneath the word. the way the spring pushes his lower lip forward slightly, the way his words come out just a fraction thicker than they would from a natural mouth. Bring the mouthwash. The mouthwash is a concoction the doctor recommended months ago, a diluted mixture that's supposed to fight the infection that never fully clears from beneath the plates, where food and bacteria collect in pockets no amount of morning cleaning can fully reach. You measure it into a small glass, and he rinses, swishes, spits into the basin, and you look away out of habit, though you've seen this exact motion 10,000 mornings running, and there is nothing left to be shocked by. You mix that wash yourself most weeks now, following a recipe the doctor wrote out on a scrap of paper you've long since memorized. Myrrh tincture, and a portion of port wine and a pinch of something bitter. The apothecary in Alexandria sells by the ounce at a price that makes you wince slightly each time you're sent to fetch more of it. The smell of the concentrated tincture, before it's diluted down to something safe for rinsing, is sharp enough to sting your own eyes if you lean too close while measuring it. Resinous and medicinal, the kind of smell that lingers on your fingers through the rest of the morning no matter how many times you wipe them on your apron. Except there is today, because when he spits there is blood in it. Not a lot. A thin red thread swirling through the pale liquid in the basin, but blood all the same. And blood in the morning basin means the swelling underneath the plate is worse than either of you wants to admit before breakfast. Sir, you keep your voice careful. Perhaps Dr. Craik should look at that swelling before you ride out today. Dr. Craik, Washington says, wiping his mouth with a cloth you hand him, has looked at every part of my mouth so many times he could draw it from memory better than any painter has managed my face. There's nothing new to look at. There is only a man growing old with a mouth that betrayed him decades before the rest of him did. You don't argue. You never argue. You simply note, the way you note everything, filing it away for later, because later there will be a moment when the swelling worsens past what mouthwash and morning cleanings can manage, and when that moment comes, you will need to remember exactly how bad it was today, so you can tell the doctor precisely how fast this is progressing. That's the job. Not just cleaning. Watching. Measuring decline in a man who refuses, out loud, to admit that he is declining at all. The morning proceeds the way every morning proceeds. You bring the razor next, and this part at least is simpler, more familiar, closer to what most men experience getting shaved by a barber, except that here the barber is a man in bondage, and the customer is the most powerful person on the continent, and the blade between them has to be perfect every single time, because a single slip, a single nick against that jaw could end very badly for the hand holding the razor. You strop the blade slowly first, testing its edge against your thumb. The small ritual of preparation you never skip, regardless of how rushed the morning has otherwise become, because a dull blade dragged across tired, sensitive skin causes its own particular unpleasantness that no amount of apologizing afterward can undo. The water has cooled from warm to lukewarm by the time you work the lather across his face, the soap smelling of tallow and lye, harsh against your own chapped knuckles, gentler, you hope, against his skin. His face, without the beard he never lets grow past a morning stubble, is long and weathered, more lined than the portraits show, sun-marked from decades of riding, decades of standing in fields directing men through smoke and noise you can only imagine because you have heard the stories but never lived them yourself. You draw the blade in careful strokes, following the grain, wiping the foam and stubble against a cloth after each pass, and neither of you speaks during this part because speaking while a blade is at your throat, even a friendly blade, even a familiar one, is not something either of you does without thinking twice. There was one morning, years back, when your own hand slipped, just slightly, a small nick along the line of his jaw that welled up a single bright bead of blood before you'd even fully registered what had happened. You froze for a half-second that felt considerably longer, the razor still raised, waiting for whatever reaction might follow, because a nicked master is not a small matter in a house like this one, and you had heard enough stories from other households, other valets, about what a moment like this could cost a man in your position. But Washington simply reached up, pressed his own thumb briefly against the small cut, and said nothing beyond a short, dry observation that the blade could stand a better edge next time, and you understood, in the particular economy of that response, both the reprimand and the mercy contained within it. You have sharpened every blade twice as carefully ever since, testing the edge against your own forearm hair before it ever comes near his face again. A small private ritual of extra caution that he has never once noticed and that you have never once mentioned. When the shave is done and his face is wiped clean and dry, you move to what comes next, and this is the part of the morning you have come, over the years, to dread the most, though you would never say so. Not to him, not to anyone. The powder. Washington's hair, what remains of it, is thin and grey now, but the wig he wears in public, or rather the powdered arrangement made from his own hair pulled back and dressed as though it were a wig, requires a process that turns the small dressing room into something closer to a bakery than a bedroom. The powder itself is fine ground starch, sometimes wheat flour when the finer powder runs short, mixed with a binding agent that makes it cling to hair, oiled beforehand with a pomade thick as lard and smelling faintly of the animal fat it's rendered from. You work the pomade through his hair first, your fingers growing slick with grease, the smell rising up thick and warm, not unpleasant exactly, but heavy, cloying. The kind of smell that gets into your own hair and clothes and stays there for the rest of the day no matter how many times you wash. Then comes the powder itself, applied with a bellows-like puffer that sends a fine cloud through the air of the small room, settling on every surface, on the dressing table, on the mirror, on your own dark shoulders, turning them faintly grey by the time the job is done. Some mornings, when the powder hangs particularly thick in the still air of a closed room, you find yourself coughing afterward despite every effort to hold your breath through the worst of the cloud. A dry, chalky cough that leaves the back of your throat feeling scraped for an hour or more. And you have wondered, standing in the yard afterward, gulping cleaner air, whether all these years of powder clouds have done something slow and permanent to your own lungs that you'll only fully understand decades from now. When your breath grows short, climbing stairs you used to climb without noticing them at all. There is no one to ask about this. No doctor examines a valet's lungs the way doctors examine a president's throat. You simply note the cough, the scraped feeling, file it alongside all the other small costs this work extracts from you, and move on to the next task waiting just beyond it. You hold your breath as best you can while you puff the powder, because breathing it in leaves a chalky taste at the back of your throat that lingers for hours, and you've learned over the years to angle your face away at the last second, though you can never quite avoid all of it. Washington sits perfectly still through this part, eyes closed, a cloth draped over his shoulders to catch the worst of the fallout, and when you're done, when his hair is dressed and powdered and gathered into the neat queue at the back of his neck, tied with a black silk ribbon, he looks finally like the man from the paintings. It has taken the better part of an hour to build that man out of the one who walked into this room with a swollen jaw and a single remaining tooth and breath that could stop a horse mid-stride. You are the one who does the building every single morning, and no one who looks at the finished painting will ever know your name, let alone your hands, though your hands are, in every sense that matters, the ones that made him. "The coat," he says, standing now, testing his jaw with a small experimental motion, wincing slightly at whatever he feels there. You bring the coat. Blue wool, buttons polished the night before until they threw back candlelight like small coins, and as you help him into it, settling the fabric across his shoulders, you notice, not for the first time, the way he holds himself differently once fully dressed. Once the private, aching, human version of himself has been folded away beneath layers of wool and powder and ivory and wire. This is the transformation you perform every single morning of your working life. Private ruin into public marble. The buttons themselves cost you the better part of an hour each evening, sitting by the last of the kitchen fire with a small tin of polish and a scrap of soft leather, working each brass disc in slow circles until the dull green tarnish that creeps onto them within a single day's wear finally lifts, and the metal beneath shines bright enough to satisfy the standard Washington expects without ever having to state it aloud. Your fingers ache by the end of that hour most nights, cramped from the small, repetitive motion, stained faintly green from the polish. No amount of washing fully removes before morning. You have counted the buttons on that coat more times than you'd like to admit, working through them one by one in the dim light, and you know the exact feel of each slightly worn edge, each faint scratch accumulated over years of the same careful nightly ritual. "Thank you, Caesar," he says, and there is something almost gentle in it. Though gentle is a strange word to use about a man who owns you, who could sell you tomorrow if the mood or the finances demanded it, who has never once in all your years serving him asked what your life is like when you leave this room and return to your own quarters, to your own family, to your own body, which aches too, which needs tending too, though nobody puffs powder through your hair or measures your pain against a doctor's schedule. "Yes, sir," you say, because that is what you say every morning, and you step back to let him walk toward the door and into the version of the day where he is George Washington, and you fold the wet cloths and empty the bloody basin water out the window into the frost-hard grass below, and begin already to think about what tomorrow morning will require, because tomorrow morning will require exactly the same thing, and the morning after that, and every morning until either his teeth or his life gives out entirely. There was a particular week, years back now, when the dentist himself came to Mount Vernon rather than the usual arrangement of Washington travelling to him, because the old set of plates had finally cracked beyond any repair you or anyone else could manage, splitting clean through the lower base one morning when Washington bit down on nothing more than a piece of soft bread, and Greenwood arrived within the fortnight with a leather case full of tools and a manner so brisk and businesslike that you found yourself, despite years of handling this exact work yourself, standing slightly in awe of a man who did for a living what you had only ever done as an extension of someone else's body. Greenwood set up in the dressing room, displacing you slightly from your usual position, though he asked to your surprise that you stay and assist, since you knew the particular contours of Washington's mouth better than any measurement he could take fresh that morning. You held the candle close while Greenwood pressed warm wax into a small tray and guided Washington's jaw down into it, watching the material take the impression of raw gum and the last remaining irregularities of bone beneath, and you watched Washington's eyes water slightly at the pressure, though he made no sound at all, hands gripping the chair arms the same way they grip them every morning for your own gentler work. The wax impression, once cooled and hardened, became the model for the new base, and Greenwood worked over the following days, carving hippopotamus ivory into the exact curve of that impression, filing and testing and refitting in a process far slower and more exacting than anything you had ever attempted yourself with the tools available in this house. You watched him select the human teeth for the new plate from a small velvet-lined case he kept in his bag, each tooth wrapped separately in a twist of paper, and you found yourself wondering, watching his careful fingers sort through them by size and shade, exactly whose mouths they had come from, and whether any coin had changed hands honestly for them, or whether, as with the set already resting in that wooden box on the dressing table, some of them had simply been taken because taking was easier than paying. You did not ask. It was not your place to ask a visiting dentist about the provenance of his materials, and you suspect, even if you had asked, the answer would have told you nothing you did not already understand about how teeth move from poor mouths into wealthy ones in this particular century. Greenwood fitted the new plate carefully, adjusting the spring tension by fractions, asking Washington again and again to bite down, to speak a few test words, to report exactly where the pressure sat wrong. And by the end of that long week, the older crack set went into a drawer as a spare, and the new set took its place in the nightly soaking dish, and the whole routine you had built over years simply absorbed the change and continued forward, because that is what routines in this house always did, absorbed whatever changed and continued forward regardless. The house settles into its daytime rhythm around you. Down in the kitchen, smoke rises from the great hearth, and the smell of cornmeal and bacon fat drifts up through the floorboards, mixing unpleasantly with the lingering ghost of tooth powder and pomade still clinging to your own hands. You wash them in the basin water, though the water is cold now and does little more than rearrange the grease across your skin rather than remove it. There is no time to wash properly. There is never time to wash properly. That luxury belongs to the man whose face you just spent an hour constructing, not to the man who constructed it. You carry the basin down the back stairs, past the pantry where Washington's niece is arguing quietly with the cook about the morning's bread, past the hallway where a slave boy no older than 10 is polishing boots that are not his own and will never be his own, out to the small yard behind the kitchen where the household waste gets emptied into a pit dug specifically for this purpose. The smell out here is different from the smell inside, less refined, more honest somehow. Chamber pots and kitchen scraps and the general accumulated filth of a household this large, all of it steaming faintly in the cold morning air. You empty the basin, the bloody water disappears into the frozen mud, and you stand there a moment longer than you need to, breathing air that, for once, doesn't smell like decay or powder or fat, just cold and wood smoke, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the river. The pit itself is its own small daily negotiation, deep enough that careless footing near the edge in winter, when the surrounding mud freezes into treacherous uneven ridges, has sent more than one servant sliding closer to its contents than anyone would ever want to slide. You've learned exactly where to plant your feet, which particular patch of ground holds firm even in the worst frost, and you take that same careful path every single morning without thinking about it consciously anymore. The way your body has simply absorbed the safe route through repetition, the same way your hands have absorbed the careful motions of cleaning a mouth that isn't your own. Back inside, there is more to do. There is always more to do. The dentures need cleaning too, once he's removed them for breakfast, because eating with the plates in is nearly impossible. The spring mechanism makes chewing awkward and painful, so Washington eats most meals with his mouth bare, gums working softened food, soups and boiled meats and bread soaked in gravy until it falls apart before it reaches his mouth. And only afterward, before greeting guests, does the ivory and bone and metal go back in. Breakfast itself, without the plates in, is its own small daily performance of adaptation that you have watched unfold across the years until you could predict it almost to the motion. The cook has learned, without ever being told directly, exactly which foods survive contact with bare gums and which do not, and the morning tray reflects that hard-won knowledge every single day. Hominy boiled until it has lost any texture at all, bread torn into pieces and left to soak in warm milk until it collapses at the touch of a spoon, egg scrambled soft rather than fried firm, because firm egg, you learned once by unfortunate accident, requires more chewing pressure than bare gums can comfortably provide. Washington eats these breakfasts alone most mornings, or with only Martha present, because the sight of him working slowly through softened food with a spoon rather than a fork is not a sight either of them particularly wants witnessed by guests or visiting officers. You've watched him, through the crack of a door left slightly open, take each spoonful with a kind of grim, private patience, pressing the soft food against his palate rather than chewing it in any way a natural mouth would chew, working it toward the back of his throat with his tongue in a motion that looks, from a distance, almost like an infant learning to eat solid food for the first time rather than a grown man who has commanded armies. You find the plates on the small table beside his breakfast setting, left there the way they always are, and you carry them back to the dressing room to clean them properly, scraping gently at the tiny gaps between the false teeth where softened bread and gravy have already begun to lodge, using a thin wooden pick and a soft brush and a basin of fresh water that will, within the hour, need emptying too. This is the part of history nobody teaches. Not the crossing of the Delaware, not the winter at Valley Forge, not the speech at his own inauguration. This quiet, endless, repetitive labour of maintaining a body that has begun to fail in ways money and position and fame cannot fix. Washington's wealth bought him the best dentures available anywhere in the world at that time, and the best dentures available anywhere in the world at that time were still, fundamentally, pieces of dead animal and human bone wired together with springs strong enough to leave permanent marks on a man's face, permanent tension in a man's jaw, permanent blood in a man's morning mouthwash. You think sometimes, working the small brush along the ridges of those false teeth, about the mouths those human teeth came from, whether the people who sold them or had them taken from them ever thought about where those teeth would end up, whether they knew, whether anyone told them, that their teeth would spend the rest of their working lives inside the mouth of the man who would become, within a handful of years, the first president of the United States, opening and closing around every speech, every toast, every quiet dinner conversation about the future of a country built in no small part on the labour and bodies of people exactly like them. There is a man on this property, older than you, who worked the smithy for years before his hands grew too stiff for the heavy work, who you have noticed more than once, running his tongue along the front of his own mouth in a particular absent way, whenever the subject of teeth comes up in casual conversation below stairs, whenever someone mentions a toothache or a dentist's visit in town. You've never asked him directly whether his teeth are among the 9 in that ledger entry. You have watched him instead, over the years, and drawn your own quiet conclusions from the gaps you've noticed in his own smile, gaps that appeared as best you can recall, sometime around the same season the ledger entry was made. He has never once complained of it to you. He has never once mentioned it at all. Some silences in this house are simply too heavy to break, even between two people who might, in another arrangement of the world, have found some comfort in finally speaking the unspoken thing aloud to each other. You never say any of this out loud. You clean the teeth. You set them back in the dish of water to soak until evening. You move on to the next task, because the next task is always waiting, and there is no room in a day like yours for the kind of reflection that would slow your hands down even a moment. By mid-morning, Washington has ridden out to inspect the fields, the way he does most days, checking on the tobacco and later the wheat that's slowly replacing it across his land, and the house exhales slightly in his absence, the way a house always exhales when the man at its centre rides away from it, even temporarily. You use this time to attend to the other parts of the job that don't involve his mouth directly. His linens need changing. His riding boots, muddy from yesterday's inspection, need cleaning and oiling, and this task, ordinary as it sounds, carries its own small unpleasantness. You've long since stopped noticing consciously, though it never fully leaves you either. The boots come off his feet each evening carrying the particular smell of a body that sweats through leather during long hours on horseback, and no amount of oiling the outside of the boot does anything at all to address what has soaked into the lining, so that every morning, opening the boot to check it's dry enough to wear, you're met with a warm, sour animal smell that clings briefly to your fingers no matter how quickly you move past it. You've learned to stuff the boots with dried herbs overnight when the weather allows for gathering them, lavender when it grows nearby, sometimes cedar shavings saved from other work around the property, small tricks that mask rather than solve the problem, but make the mornings marginally more bearable for both of you. His correspondence stacked on the study desk needs organising by his own specific and exacting system that took you years to fully memorise, but your mind keeps drifting back to the swelling, the blood in the morning basin. You've seen this pattern before, years back, right before the worst episode. The one where an abscess beneath one of his remaining natural teeth grew so severe that Dr. Craik had to lance it right there in the dressing room. You holding the basin while blood and pus drained out in a stream thick enough to make even you, hardened as you are to unpleasant sights, turn your face away for a moment. You remember that day clearly, the smell of it, sweetish and foul at once, unlike anything else you've encountered in this work. The sound Washington made, a low sound through gritted teeth, refusing, as always, to cry out properly, even as the doctor's blade opened the swelling and the pressure that had built up for days finally released. You remember holding a cloth to his jaw afterward, pressing gently, watching the swelling slowly recede over the following days, even as the fear settled into both of you that it could happen again, would happen again, because there was always another tooth beneath the surface working its way toward the same fate. That was 3 teeth ago. Now there is 1 tooth left, and you find yourself wondering, standing in the study organising letters you can read, but were never taught to read for your own benefit, only for his. What happens when that last tooth finally goes the way of all the others? Whether the dentures will simply take over completely, upper and lower plates resting directly on bare gum with no natural anchor left at all, whether the pain of that transition will be worse, or somehow, mercifully, less, because there will be nothing left to abscess, nothing left to infect, just the permanent dull ache of ivory grinding against raw gum every single day for the rest of his life. The afternoon brings visitors, as afternoons at Mount Vernon often do. A pair of gentlemen from Alexandria come to discuss some matter of local business, and you're called to help prepare the receiving room, to fetch the good Madeira from the cellar, to stand near enough to be useful and far enough to be invisible. The particular skill required of every servant in a house like this one. The cellar stairs are steep and uneven, worn smooth in the middle by decades of feet before yours, and the air down there carries its own particular cold, damp and mineral, smelling of packed earth and old wood, and the faint sweetness of wine that has seeped, over years, into the very stone of the walls. You navigate the narrow aisle between racks by memory more than by the single candle you carry, your fingers finding the specific bottle by the shape of its wax seal, before your eyes have even fully adjusted to the gloom, and you climb back up those same worn stairs, balancing the bottle carefully against your chest. Because a dropped bottle of good Madeira is the kind of mistake that follows a servant for months in the retelling, whispered about in kitchens up and down the county long after the actual spilled wine has been mopped from the floor. Washington greets his guests with the full public face fully assembled, powder and plates and blue wool coat, and you watch from your position near the sideboard as he speaks, carefully, the way he always speaks now in shorter sentences than he once did, avoiding words with too many hard consonants that might catch awkwardly against the spring mechanism, avoiding above all laughter, because laughter with a full mouth of ivory and human teeth risks the plates shifting, risks an undignified click or worse, a visible gap appearing where the upper plate has slipped, and Washington has spent years perfecting the art of a controlled, closed-mouth smile that gives away nothing of what lies behind it. You've heard him practice this smile, actually, alone in his study some evenings, muttering to himself in front of the small mirror he keeps there, adjusting the angle of his jaw, testing how far he can part his lips before the metal shows. You were not meant to see this. You saw it anyway one evening, bringing in a fresh candle, and you backed out of the room as quietly as you'd entered, and you have never spoken of it. Not to him, not to anyone, filing it away with all the other private ruins you've witnessed in service of this public marble man. The candle you carried that evening trembled slightly in your hand as you retreated, wax dripping warm over your knuckles, and you remember standing in the dark hallway afterward for a long moment, heart beating faster than the small interruption should have warranted, understanding somehow, even without fully articulating it to yourself, that you had witnessed something he would consider a far greater vulnerability than any swollen gum or bloody basin, a private vanity so carefully guarded that its exposure felt, in that instant, more dangerous to both of you than any of the actual physical unpleasantness you manage together every single morning. The gentlemen stay through the afternoon, discussing whatever business gentlemen discuss, and you refill glasses and adjust the fire and wait, mostly for the visit to end, because visits like this one mean Washington's jaw stays clenched around that spring-loaded discomfort for hours longer than usual. And you know, without being told, that by evening the pain will have worsened considerably from the strain of maintaining that careful, controlled expression through an entire afternoon of small talk about crop prices and shipping routes. When the guests finally leave, when their carriage rattles away down the long drive and the front door closes behind them, Washington doesn't say a word. He simply walks past you toward the study, and you follow, because that's the job. And once the door closes behind the two of you, alone again, he reaches up and works his jaw with his fingers, pressing gently at the hinge, exhaling slowly through his nose, "Take these out," he says, meaning the plates, and you help him remove them right there in the study, setting them on a small tray you've learned to keep nearby for exactly this purpose, because some days the pain simply cannot wait until proper evening removal in the dressing room. His face collapses inward the moment the plates come free, and he sits heavily in his chair, rubbing at his jaw, and for a moment, just a moment, he looks less like a president as more like an old man in genuine pain, which is, underneath everything else, exactly what he is. "Bring the laudanum," he says, and you do, measuring out careful drops into a small glass of wine, watching him drink it down in one motion, watching his shoulders slowly ease as the medicine begins its slow work against the pain radiating from that single remaining tooth and the raw, swollen gum around it. You've grown careful, over the years, about the laudanum specifically, more careful than anyone has ever instructed you to be, because you have watched, in other households, in other men, what happens when the relief that particular medicine offers becomes something closer to a need than a treatment. There was a planter 2 properties over, a man you'd met a handful of times at market, whose own valet confided once, over shared tobacco during a rare evening off, that his master had grown so dependent on the drops that he could no longer sleep without them, no longer rise in the morning without them. His whole temperament reshaped around the medicine's slow grip, until the man barely resembled the person his household remembered from years before. You carried that story home with you and thought about it for weeks afterward, watching your own careful measuring of Washington's dose with new eyes, understanding for the first time exactly what you were guarding against every single time you levelled that small spoon rather than heaping it. You measure the drops exactly, no more than the doctor prescribed, and you have, on more than one occasion, quietly diluted a dose slightly when you judged Washington's request, for it to come more from habit than from genuine pain, watering the wine just enough that the medicine's effect would arrive gentler and fade sooner. A small private intervention you have never once discussed with him or with anyone else. You do not know for certain whether he has noticed this quiet management on your part. Some mornings, when the bottle in the cabinet seems to be lasting longer than the frequency of his complaints would suggest it should, you wonder if he has simply chosen not to ask, trusting your judgment on this the same way he trusts your judgment on the fit of a plate or the readiness of a coat, an unspoken confidence built slowly over decades that his own comfort and perhaps his own safety from the very medicine meant to ease him rests partly in your hands as much as it rests in the doctor's. You clean the plates while he sits with his eyes closed, waiting for the laudanum to take hold, and you think, not for the first time, about how strange this arrangement is, how the most powerful man on the continent depends entirely on the careful, practiced hands of a man he owns to manage the most basic functions of his own face, and how neither of you has ever once acknowledged out loud the strangeness of that dependency, because acknowledging it would require admitting something about the whole structure of this house, this plantation, this country, being born out of exactly this kind of unspoken, unbalanced intimacy. Martha comes to the dressing room sometimes, not often, but often enough that you have learned to recognize the particular knock she uses, softer than a servant's knock, more like a question than an announcement. She does not stay long on these visits, and she never watches the actual cleaning, always finding some reason to busy herself with the wardrobe or the window curtains while you work. But you have come to understand over the years that her presence in the room during these mornings is its own kind of care, a way of being near her husband during the one part of his day when he is least able to perform strength for anyone, without ever having to witness directly the specific unpleasantness of what that weakness looks like up close. There was a morning, memorable to you because it happened so rarely, when she did watch, standing near the door with her hands folded, silent, while you worked the small brush along what remained of his gums, and when you finished, when the plates were fitted and the transformation from private ruin to public marble was complete, she crossed the room and touched his cheek gently, the way you imagine she might have touched it decades earlier when both of them were young, and his mouth was still simply his own, untouched by ivory or wire or the slow accumulating debts of age. "You look well this morning," she said, and there was something deliberate in the way she said it, a kindness offered not because it was strictly true, but because it was the thing he needed to hear before walking out into a day that would ask him to look, and to be, considerably more composed than he actually felt. You've thought about that exchange many times since, the particular grace of a lie told out of love rather than deception, and you've wondered whether your own careful morning work, the cleaning and fitting and powdering, might be understood the same way, not as concealment exactly, but as a kind of daily mercy extended toward a man whose body has begun, slowly and irreversibly, to fail him in ways neither wealth nor position can fully repair. Evening comes eventually, the way evening always comes, and with it the final ritual of the day, the removal of the plates for the night, the cleaning, the soaking, the application of a fresh salve to the swollen gum that Dr. Craik left weeks ago, and that seems to help less and less each time you use it. Washington sits in his nightshirt again, the way he sat this morning, jaw aching, face sunken, the powder brushed from his hair and the coat hung carefully in the wardrobe, and you work through the same motions in reverse, undoing everything you built at dawn. "Tomorrow," he says as you finish, "send word to Dr. Craik. I think perhaps you were right this morning." "Yes, sir." You keep your voice level, though something in you eases slightly at this small admission, this rare moment where he lets the careful public performance slip enough to acknowledge that his servant's assessment of his own body was in fact correct. "I'll send the boy first thing." "Thank you, Caesar." He says your name again, the way he said it this morning, and there's something in the tiredness of his voice that makes it sound almost like an apology, though you know it isn't, not really. Not in any way that would change anything about tomorrow, or the day after, or any of the morning still ahead of both of you in this house. You bank the fire low, set the candle within easy reach of the bed, and gather the tools back into their wooden box, latching the brass clasp with a small familiar click. Outside, the Potomac has gone fully dark now, fog thick across it again, the same fog that was there this morning before either of you had risen, before the day had asked anything of either of you yet. Before you leave the dressing room for the night, you take a moment, as you always do, to wash your own hands properly in whatever water remains warm enough to bother with, working the grease and powder and faint lingering smell of his mouth off your skin as best you can, though you know from long experience that some trace of it will still be there tomorrow morning no matter how thoroughly you scrub tonight. Your knuckles have gone red and slightly raw, from the day's repeated washing, cold water and lye soap wearing at skin that gets no gentler treatment than the coat buttons or the razor blades you tend with such care for someone else's comfort. You carry the box back to its place on the dressing table, and you stand there a moment in the near dark, listening to the house settle around you, the creak of old wood, the distant murmur of voices from the kitchen where the other servants are finishing their own long day. And you think about tomorrow morning, when you will do all of this again, exactly the same, from the moment his door opens and he says your name in that thick, careful, toothless voice, through the cleaning and the plates and the powder and the coat, building him back into the man the world will see, one aching motion at a time. This will happen for years yet. You don't know that tonight, standing in the dark dressing room with a box of tools cooling under your hand, but it's true. Years of mornings exactly like this one. Years of blood in the basin and swelling that never fully resolves, and a single tooth that will eventually join all the others in whatever quiet grave teeth go to when a mouth finally gives up holding on to them. Years of powder settling into your own hair and your own lungs. Years of a man's public dignity depending entirely on your private, unacknowledged labour. You have learned, over these years, to find something like peace in the routine itself. Not because the routine is kind to you, it isn't, but because routine, at least, is predictable. And predictable is more than most things in your life are allowed to be. You know exactly what tomorrow will ask of you. You know exactly how the basin water will look when you empty it. Exactly how the powder will settle on your shoulders. Exactly how his jaw will feel under your fingers when you check the swelling that never truly disappears. Down the hall, a door closes softly. Somewhere in the house, someone is banking a fire for the night. Someone else is folding linens, and the whole enormous machinery of this place continues turning, the way it turns every night. Servants and owners bound together in a structure none of you chose but all of you maintain. Morning after morning, tooth after failing tooth, one careful ritual at a time. You finally allow yourself to leave the dressing room, walking down the back stairs toward your own quarters, where your own family waits, where your own body, aching from a day spent in service of someone else's comfort, will finally get to rest, however briefly, before the whole cycle begins again with the first grey light through the window and the sound of his voice saying your name. There is another part of this work that has nothing to do with the mouth, and you learn it slower, over months rather than mornings, because it isn't taught to you directly. It's simply absorbed through repetition the way everything in this house gets absorbed. Washington does not like water on his skin, not the way you might expect a man of his stature to dislike it, out of some genteel fear of chills or ague, though he'll cite that fear readily enough if a guest presses him on the subject. The truth, the part you've learned only from years of standing close enough to smell it, is that full bathing happens rarely in this house, weeks apart sometimes, longer in winter, and what passes for cleanliness in between is a system of linen changes and vigorous dry rubbing with rough cloth that moves the smell around more than it removes it. You are the one who manages that system. Fresh shirts each morning, the linen crisp and cool against skin that never quite loses the particular sour warmth of a body that sweats through wool coats in summer and huddles, unwashed near fires in winter. You learn to hold your breath at certain angles, the underarms especially, where the fabric grows damp and stays damp for hours in humid weather, and you learn too the specific vocabulary of odours that different seasons produce. Summer brings something sharp and animal, closer to the smell of a horse worked too hard, mixed with whatever pomade has melted slightly against his scalp in the heat. Winter brings something heavier, more stagnant, the smell of a body kept too long in the same clothes near too many fires, skin gone slightly grey and flaky at the elbows and knees, from dryness that no one thinks to treat because bathing, the obvious remedy, is precisely the thing everyone in this century has been taught to fear. You remember the specific horror, years back now, of the one season Washington did attempt more frequent washing, following some pamphlet a visiting doctor left behind about the healthful properties of cold water applied to the skin. For nearly a month you hauled extra buckets up the back stairs each morning, heated what you could over the kitchen fire, and stood by while he lowered himself into a shallow tin tub, barely large enough to crouch in, gasping faintly at the cold that never fully left the water no matter how much hot water you added to it. He caught a chill halfway through that month, a real one. Fever and chest congestion bad enough that Dr. Crake was called, and the whole household quietly, without anyone saying so directly, understood the experiment to be over. The tub went back to the storage room. The dry rubbing with rough cloth resumed, and you went back to managing the smell through linen changes and careful timing, rather than through anything approaching what a later century would recognize as basic hygiene. Hair is its own separate battle, layered on top of everything else. Underneath the powder and the careful queue tied with black silk ribbon, his scalp itches more often than he'll admit. A dry, flaking itch that worsens whenever the pomade sits too many days without washing, and you've learned to work your fingers gently along his hairline during the morning dressing, not massaging exactly, just distributing the oil evenly enough to keep the worst of the flaking from showing on the shoulders of his dark coats. You check, too, for the small dark specks that appear sometimes near the base of his queue, lice eggs clinging stubbornly to hair shafts despite the powder and pomade that should, in theory, discourage them. And when you find them, you say nothing. Simply work a fine-tooth comb through the affected section that evening after the powder's been brushed out, catching what you can, knowing you'll never catch all of it, knowing the eggs you miss tonight will hatch within the week, and the whole quiet, unspoken battle will begin again. Summer brings its own separate misery, less dramatic than the frozen basin water, but wearing in its own steady way. The dressing room turns close and airless by mid-morning most July days, the small fire you keep for warming water in winter replaced by nothing at all, so the water for cleaning stays merely tepid rather than properly warm, and sweat gathers at your own hairline within minutes of beginning the morning's work, trickling down the back of your neck while you lean in close over his mouth, careful never to let a single drop fall where it shouldn't. The powder clumps differently in humid air, sticking in unpredictable patches rather than settling evenly. And you've learned to work faster in these months too, racing the moisture in the air itself before it can ruin an hour's careful arrangement of his hair. Winter itself becomes its own separate character in this work, one you have learned to negotiate with as carefully as you negotiate with Washington's failing mouth. The dressing room, despite the small fire kept burning in its grate most mornings, never fully warms before the sun is well up, and you have spent more winters than you can count with your own fingers gone stiff and clumsy from cold, before the morning's tasks are even half finished, fumbling the small brush, dropping the wooden pick once, memorably, straight into the basin of water where you had to fish it out again with fingers so numb you could barely feel whether you'd actually caught it. The water itself fights you in winter, cooling from merely warm to genuinely cold within minutes of leaving the kettle, so that by the time you've finished cleaning one side of his mouth, the cloth has already lost whatever gentle warmth made the process bearable at the start. You learn to work faster in the cold months, sacrificing some of the careful thoroughness you'd prefer for the sake of simply finishing before the water turns to something closer to ice water. And you learn, too, to keep a second kettle warming throughout the whole routine, refilling the basin part-way through no matter how much extra work that adds to your morning. Your own hands suffer through these months in ways no one in the main house ever asks about. The skin across your knuckles cracks in the cold, deep enough sometimes to bleed, especially after long stretches of washing linens or basins in water that never gets properly hot before your fingers go numb from the air itself. You have learned to work through this the way you have learned to work through everything else this life demands, wrapping your own hands at night in scraps of cloth, soaked with whatever grease is available. Tallow usually, sometimes a bit of the same pomade that goes into Washington's hair, though you'd never admit to using it on yourself if anyone asked, because that particular pomade is expensive, imported, meant for a master's hair and not a servant's cracked knuckles. Your wife notices before you ever say a word about it, the way she notices most things about your body that you'd rather keep silent about, and on the worst winter night she takes your hands into her lap without asking, working a bit of her own saved grease into the cracked skin with slow, careful circles that ease something in you far beyond the simple, physical relief of the treatment itself. She has her own chapped hands from her own long days at the washtub, and there is a particular tenderness in the way two people with equally ruined hands tend to each other's damage anyway, neither one waiting for the other to heal first before offering what small comfort they can manage. There is a particular morning, one hard winter years into this work, when the water in the basin actually freezes overnight despite the banked fire, a thin skin of ice you have to break with the handle of a brush before you can even begin warming it for the day's cleaning. And you remember standing there in the grey pre-dawn light, breath visible in the cold air of the dressing room, thinking that this small, unglamorous struggle against frozen water was, in its way, just as real a battle as any Washington had ever fought on any actual battlefield. Though no one would ever write a history of it, no one would ever paint a portrait commemorating the servant who broke the ice in the basin so the general's mouth could be cleaned before breakfast. That same winter, the Potomac itself froze solid enough near the bank for a handful of the household's children to skate across a shallow stretch of it on a rare free Sunday afternoon, and you stood at the edge of the yard for a few stolen minutes watching them slide and shriek with laughter, their breath rising in little clouds above them, and you thought, watching that small unguarded joy, about how completely separate that world was from the one waiting for you inside the dressing room the following morning, how a single river could hold both the delight of children at play and the grim private struggle of a servant breaking ice from a basin before dawn, depending entirely on which bank of it you happen to be standing on. You've heard the other valets in Alexandria and Williamsburg complain, in the rare moments servants from different households cross paths at market or at church, about their own master's particular grooming horrors, and you've come to understand that Washington's situation, however unpleasant to manage day to day, is not unusual for a man of his age and generation. Wealth buys better dentures, better powder, better pomade, but wealth does not buy actual cleanliness in any way a later century would recognize it, because the entire century simply hasn't arrived yet at the understanding that water and soap, applied regularly and thoroughly, might solve more problems than they cause. You are managing, in effect, a body being cared for according to rules that will look, generations from now, almost willfully self-destructive, and there is nothing you can do about that except manage the consequences as best your hands and your patience allow, morning after morning, season after season. There is one dinner in particular that you still think about years later, whenever a new set of guests is announced at the door, and you find yourself running through the familiar mental checklist of everything that could go wrong between the dressing room and the dining table. A French delegation had come through, 3 men with elaborate manners and elaborate wigs of their own, powdered so heavily that a faint cloud rose from each of them whenever they bowed, and Washington had insisted on a full formal dinner, hours long, course after course, precisely the kind of extended event that puts the most strain on a mouth held together with brass springs and other people's teeth. You had fitted the plates carefully that morning, checked the swelling, adjusted the paste lining as best you could, and sent him off to greet his guests with every confidence that the day would proceed the way most formal days proceeded, which is to say with careful management rather than any real ease. But somewhere around the third course, word came back to the kitchen, carried by the boy who'd been stationed near the dining room to refill glasses, that something had gone wrong at the table. You were in the hallway within minutes, close enough to the dining room door to hear without being seen, and what you heard was Washington's voice, tight and careful in a way you recognized immediately, working around a sentence with unusual caution, and then a small, sharp sound, metal against porcelain, followed by a silence that stretched a half-second too long before the French delegate's polite laughter filled the gap. You learned, later that evening, once the guests had gone and the house had settled and you were alone with him in the dressing room again, exactly what had happened. A piece of roasted fowl, cut smaller than usual but still apparently not small enough, had caught against the upper plate at precisely the wrong angle, and for one terrible moment at the table, in front of 3 foreign dignitaries whose opinion of the young country's leadership mattered more than either of you wanted to admit, the plate had shifted forward, just slightly, just enough to be visible, a thin dark gap appearing at the front of his smile before he managed, through what must have been considerable effort and no small amount of controlled panic, to press his tongue against the plate and ease it back into place without anyone at the table quite registering what they'd seen. They didn't notice, he said that evening, though the way he said it made clear he wasn't entirely certain of that himself, and you helped him remove the plates with hands that were, for once, not entirely steady either, because you understood exactly how close that evening had come to becoming a story told in French salons for years afterward, the American general whose teeth fell out at his own dinner table. After that night, you began cutting his meat yourself before it ever reached his plate at formal dinners, slipping into the dining room under the pretense of refilling glasses, taking his plate briefly to a side table where you could work the knife through whatever tough cut of meat the cook had prepared, reducing it to pieces small enough that no amount of chewing pressure could ever again catch wrong against that fragile mechanism of ivory and spring and borrowed teeth. No one ever commented on this small deviation from ordinary service. No one, as far as you could tell, ever noticed it as anything other than a valet being especially attentive. But you knew, and Washington knew, exactly what that extra cutting was protecting against, and neither of you ever spoke of it directly, the way you never spoke of most of the things that mattered most in this particular arrangement. The guests who visited Mount Vernon in those years came in a steady stream, some for an afternoon, some for a week or more, and each visit brought its own small set of hazards to manage. There was the matter of laughter, always the matter of laughter, because certain guests, certain evenings, certain stories told after enough Madeira had gone around the table, produced a kind of unguarded mirth that Washington could not always fully suppress, and you learned to watch his shoulders during these moments, the particular way they'd tense just before a genuine laugh threatened to break free, and you learned, too, that there was nothing you could do about it in the moment itself, except stand ready with a cloth and a glass of water for afterward, in case the laugh had shifted anything that would need quiet correction once the guests had retired for the evening. There was one particular evening, a raucous dinner full of old friends recounting some improbable hunting mishap from their younger years, when the laughter caught him fully off guard, a real, unguarded burst of it that filled the whole dining room before he could catch himself, and you saw, from your position near the sideboard, the briefest flicker of alarm cross his face immediately afterward, as his tongue checked the plate's position, relief following a half-second later when he found everything still seated correctly. No one at the table noticed a thing. Only you, watching for exactly that flicker the way you always watched for it, understood what had actually passed between one heartbeat and the next. There was the matter of cold weather visits, when guests arrived numb from carriage rides through frost and expected mulled wine served hot enough to warm hands and throats alike, and hot liquid against ivory plates produces its own particular discomfort, an ache that spreads through the whole upper jaw and takes long minutes to fade, minutes Washington spent smiling through with practiced control, while his actual experience of the moment was closer to quiet endurance than anything resembling hospitality's usual warmth. There was, too, the particular hazard of guests who lingered too long after dinner, past the hour when Washington's endurance for maintaining the careful public mouth had any reserve left in it. You remember one such evening, a delegation of officers passing through on their way south, whose visit stretched well past midnight on the strength of old war stories and better brandy than the house usually served, and you stood near the door of the dining room long after you would normally have been dismissed, watching Washington's jaw work more and more carefully with each passing hour, his responses growing shorter, his sentences more economical, not from disinterest in his guests, but from simple physical exhaustion accumulating behind a face that could not show it. By the time the last officer finally rose to retire, well past 1 in the morning, Washington's hand shook faintly, reaching for his own candle, and you were at his side within seconds, taking the candle from him under the guise of lighting his way, giving him a moment to simply exist without needing to hold his face in that careful, composed shape for even one more observer. Once the dressing-room door closed behind the two of you, he sank into the chair by the window and simply sat there for a long moment before saying anything at all, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its dinner-table composure left in it. "Get these out of my mouth, Caesar. Now, if you please." You had never heard him say please in quite that tone before, stripped of all its usual courtesy and reduced to something closer to a plea, and you worked as quickly and gently as you could to free the plates from gums that had been clenched around them for the better part of 6 hours, understanding in that moment exactly how much every single formal evening in this house actually cost him, regardless of how effortless he made it look to the men drinking his brandy and admiring his composure. And there was the matter, hardest of all to manage, of guests who brought their own dental troubles to compare, because dental troubles were common enough among wealthy men of a certain age that conversation sometimes turned, after enough wine, toward comparing notes on dentists and remedies and the various tortures each man's mouth had put him through over the years. These conversations should have been, in theory, a relief, an acknowledgement that Washington's suffering was not unique, not a private shame, but a common affliction of the age. But you noticed, standing near the sideboard through these exchanges, that Washington rarely joined in fully, offering only vague agreement, never the specific details that his own guests seemed happy enough to share about their own mouths. Some pride, you came to understand, survived even the total collapse of a man's natural teeth, and that pride demanded silence about the particulars, even among peers suffering the exact same fate. You think, some years into this work, that you have come to understand something about vanity that most people never have occasion to learn. which is that vanity does not require actual beauty to sustain itself, only the careful maintenance of an illusion convincing enough that no one examines it too closely. Washington's public face, powder and ivory and controlled expression, convinces nearly everyone who encounters it that they are looking at a man of natural dignity and composure. Almost none of them understand that dignity, in this specific case, is manufactured fresh each morning by hands not his own, out of materials that include, whether anyone at the dinner table wants to think about it or not, the literal teeth of people enslaved on the very property where the dinner is being served. The years pass the way years do in a house like this, slowly at first, and then all at once. The single remaining tooth finally goes as you always knew it would, not dramatically, not with the abscess and the lancing you half expected, but quietly, loosening over the course of a winter until one morning it simply comes free in your hand while you're cleaning, small and yellowed and unremarkable, the last living remnant of the mouth Washington was born with, and neither of you says anything about it, though you both understand what it means. From that morning forward, the plates rest on bare gum alone, upper and lower, ivory against raw flesh with nothing left to anchor either one, and the daily ritual of cleaning and fitting and adjusting grows, if anything, more delicate, more careful, because there is no longer any margin for the small errors that a single remaining tooth used to help correct. You learn new tricks in those years, a thicker paste to line the inside of the plates where they rub raw against the gum, one you mix yourself most weeks now from beeswax, softened over a low flame and a portion of the same tooth powder, working it between your fingers until it reaches a consistency somewhere between candle wax and butter, left too long near a fire, warm and slightly tacky against your skin, cooling fast once it's pressed into place along the plate's inner curve. A softer diet mostly, though Washington insists on appearing at public dinners with a full plate in front of him, regardless of what he can actually chew, cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces, moving it around more than eating it. A performance of normal eating that fools most guests most of the time. You learn to read the particular tightness at the corner of his jaw that means the pain has crossed from manageable into something worse. And on those days you find excuses to check on him more often than usual, bringing water he didn't ask for, adjusting cushions he didn't request. Small acts of attention disguised as ordinary service. The war years, when they come again in memory over dinner conversations with old officers who visit, get discussed at length, battles refought in careful detail across the table, but you notice, standing near the sideboard the way you always stand, that Washington speaks less and less as these evenings wear on, letting his old comrades carry the conversation, because speaking for long stretches has become, itself, a kind of quiet endurance test, jaw aching, plates shifting slightly with every extended sentence, and you understand, better than any of his guests ever will, exactly how much effort it costs him simply to sit through an evening of pleasant reminiscence. One such officer, a general who had served beside Washington through some of the war's hardest winters, visited often enough in those years that you came to recognize the particular rhythm of his stories. The same battles told slightly differently each time depending on how much wine had gone around the table first. You noticed, watching Washington across these repeated evenings, how he had developed a small private repertoire of responses that required almost no real speech at all. A slow nod, a brief huff of breath that could pass for laughter without ever risking the plates, a raised glass in place of whatever toast his old comrade expected him to offer in return. The old general never seemed to notice how little his host actually said across these long evenings. He left each visit, as far as you could tell, perfectly satisfied that he'd spent a fine night in good company, never once suspecting how much careful, silent management had gone into making that satisfaction possible. You remember the day before that December evening with a clarity that unsettles you even now, because in hindsight it carried every warning sign neither of you chose to heed. Washington had ridden out at first light despite a cold rain already falling steadily, insisting the fences along the far field needed inspecting before the ground froze too hard for the workers to finish the repairs, and he had stayed out through the worst of it, hours longer than any sensible man would have stayed out in weather like that. Coming home well after dark, soaked through to the skin, his greatcoat heavy with rainwater, his boots so waterlogged you had to work a full 10 minutes just to pry them free of his swollen, chilled feet. You remember toweling his hair dry that night, noticing how cold his scalp felt under your hands, colder than simple weather should have left it, and you remember suggesting as gently as you dared that perhaps a hot posset and an early bed might serve him better than the hour he'd planned to spend afterward reviewing correspondence in his unheated study. He waved off the suggestion the way he waved off most suggestions concerning his own comfort, insisting the correspondence couldn't wait, and you helped him into dry clothes and left him to his letters, with a private unease you couldn't quite name at the time, though you would spend the following days understanding exactly what that unease had been trying to tell you. By the next morning, the morning the throat first grew sore, you found yourself wishing, uselessly, that you had pressed harder the night before, had insisted on the hot posset and the early bed regardless of what he wanted, and you carried that small, useless regret through the entire frightening ordeal that followed, understanding even as you carried it that a servant's insistence, however well meant, has never once in the history of this house been strong enough to overrule a master's own stubborn will. There comes a particular December evening, years into this routine, cold enough that the windows frost over from the inside, when the swelling returns in a way you haven't seen since the very worst episode, years back, with the abscess and the lancing. This time it's not a tooth causing it, because there are no teeth left to cause anything. This time it's something else entirely, a general soreness of the throat that Washington mentions almost in passing, after a long day spent out in the freezing rain, overseeing some matter on the property, a soreness that by evening has become a rasp in his voice, and by the following morning has become something that frightens you in a way none of the dental crises ever quite managed to. You are called to his room before dawn, earlier than usual, and you find him struggling to breathe properly, his voice reduced to a strained whisper. And for the first time in all your years of service, you see something in his eyes that you recognize, with a cold drop in your stomach, as genuine fear. This is not a swollen jaw. This is not a bleeding gum. This is something moving through his chest and throat that neither of you has the tools or the knowledge to manage the way you've managed every small crisis of teeth and ivory over the years. You spend the hours before the first doctor arrives doing the only things you know how to do, the only things this whole life has trained your hands to do, and none of them feel like enough. You bring warm cloths for his throat, wringing them out over and over in a basin that cools too quickly no matter how often you refresh it from the kitchen fire below. You prop him higher against the pillows when the laboured breathing seems worse lying flat, and you notice, with a fear that sits cold in your stomach despite the heat of the room, how much effort even that small adjustment costs him, his hand gripping your forearm harder than he has ever gripped it before. Not out of anger, never out of anger, but out of something closer to a drowning man's grip on anything solid nearby. His skin has gone an unfamiliar colour by mid-morning, not the pale, sunken look of a bad dental morning, but something greyer, tinged faintly blue at the lips, and his voice, when he manages to force air past whatever is closing in his throat, comes out as barely more than a rasping whisper, words you have to lean close to catch at all. You send the stable boy for the first doctor yourself, shouting instructions down the back stairs with an urgency you rarely allow yourself to show in this house, because urgency in a servant is so often read as insolence. But this morning there is no room left for careful deportment, only for speed. Martha arrives before the doctor does, still in her night clothes, hair loose around her shoulders in a way you have never once seen it before, and she takes up a position on the opposite side of the bed from you without a word, her hand finding his other hand, and for a long stretch of minutes the three of you simply exist together in that cold room, listening to each laboured breath, counting the gaps between them the way you might count the gaps between lightning and thunder, trying to measure how much danger is actually approaching by how far off the next struggling inhale sounds. Doctors arrive throughout the day, more than one called from town in a hurry that itself tells you everything about how serious this has become. You're sent from the room during parts of the treatment, the bleeding they perform, drawing blood from his arm in quantities that seem, even to your untrained eye, dangerously large. And through the closed door you hear the specific wet sound of the basin filling, the low murmured instructions between the doctors, the occasional strained sound from Washington himself that he would never, under ordinary circumstances, allow anyone to hear him make. You stand in the hallway with your back against the coal plaster wall, hands pressed flat against your own thighs to stop them from shaking, and you think, not for the first time that day, about every morning you have spent tending this same body with far gentler instruments than the doctors are currently using, and how strange it feels to be excluded now, at the moment when the stakes have finally grown large enough to matter to the rest of the world, watching from outside this house. Down in the kitchen, word has already spread through the whole household, and you can hear it in the unusual quiet that has settled over the place. None of the ordinary clatter and chatter of a working day, just hushed voices and people finding small excuses to pass near the main stairs, hoping for some scrap of news to carry back to whoever they answer to. Frank finds you at one point during that long, uncertain afternoon, his face pale, asking in a whisper whether it's true that the general is dying, and you don't have an honest answer to give him, not yet, so you simply tell him to fetch more clean water and keep the fires built up throughout the house. Because uncertainty is easier to carry when your hands have something useful to do inside it, a lesson you learned decades ago and are only now, watching it settle into a frightened boy's face, fully understanding how much it has always cost you to practice yourself. When you are allowed back in to help settle him afterward, he is pale in a way you've never seen him pale before, a waxy grey that makes the powder still dusted faintly through his hair look almost obscene by contrast. Too festive for a face this drained of colour. A cloth wrapped around his upper arm shows a dark spot of blood already seeping through, and his breathing is still laboured. His voice, when he manages to speak at all, barely more than a whisper, thin as paper. Nothing like the voice that has commanded rooms and armies, and, in this very house, a household of servants who've learned to snap to attention at the first syllable of their names. Caesar, he manages, and you lean close the way you've leaned close every morning for years, except this time it isn't to clean his mouth or fit his plates, It's simply to hear whatever he might have left to say. And there's something in that reversal, in being needed for your presence rather than your specific practiced labour, that unsettles you more than the fear on his face already has. He doesn't say anything else that evening. You sit with him through the worst of the night, along with the doctors, along with his wife, everyone in the room understanding, without saying it directly, that this might be the night the whole careful machinery of the household stops, that all the years of morning rituals and powder and ivory teeth might be building toward an ending none of you are prepared for, regardless of how much you have all quietly prepared for the smaller crises that came before. He does not die that night, but the hours that follow the bleeding stretch long and uncertain, the household holding its collective breath through a darkness that seems to move slower than any night you've ever sat through in this house. You take turns at his bedside with Martha and with one of the doctors who stays through the worst of it, and somewhere near dawn, when the light outside has just begun to grey the frost on the window panes, his breathing shifts, deepens, catches a rhythm that sounds less like struggle and more like actual rest, and the doctor sitting nearest the bed exhales slowly, a sound of relief so quiet you almost miss it, and murmurs that the crisis, whatever it truly was, seems to have passed. You do not sleep yourself that night, not for one single minute, though your body aches with a tiredness that goes bone deep by the time the sun has fully risen. You spend the following days in a kind of suspended watchfulness, checking on him more often than your usual duties require, bringing broth he can barely manage to swallow, changing the linens beneath him when the fever breaks and soaks the sheets through, noting every small sign of improvement with a private, unspoken relief you would never dare voice aloud in front of anyone who might read too much into a servant, caring quite this much about his master's survival. He rallies, slowly over the following days, breathing easier, colour returning bit by bit until the waxy grey finally gives way to something closer to his ordinary weathered complexion, and you find yourself back in the familiar dressing room within the week, fitting the plates again, working the powder through what's left of his hair, rebuilding the public man out of the private one. The same routine you've performed 1,000 mornings before this one, except that your hands, this particular week, tremble faintly at the start of each task in a way they haven't trembled since you were a boy. First learning this work, and it takes you the better part of that week before the trembling finally settles, and your hands remember how to be merely skilled again rather than simply grateful. But something has shifted in the doing of it, some awareness unspoken between you, that the routine itself is fragile, that all the careful maintenance in the world only postpones rather than prevents the thing every single body is eventually working toward. There is a particular kind of dread that arrives whenever word comes from Philadelphia or New York that a painter has been commissioned again, because painters, unlike dinner guests, require Washington to sit motionless for hours at a stretch, mouth held in that same careful closed position, and a closed mouth held for hours produces its own slow, mounting agony that no amount of morning preparation can entirely prevent. You remember one such sitting particularly clearly. A portraitist down from the north with an easel and a set of brushes and an insistence, polite but immovable, that the light was best between 10 and 2, precisely the hours when the ache in Washington's jaw tends to build toward its worst point of the day. You were stationed just outside the room for most of that sitting, close enough to be summoned quickly, and you watched through the gap left by a door not quite closed as the painter worked with the particular concentration of a man trying to capture something true. unaware that the expression he was so carefully rendering in oil, the firm set jaw, the composed unsmiling mouth, was not a choice of temperament at all, but the direct physical consequence of ivory plates grinding slowly against raw gum for the third consecutive hour. Around the second hour you were called in briefly, and you found Washington's eyes doing something you'd learned to recognize over the years. A slight narrowing at the corners that meant the pain had crossed some private threshold he'd stopped trying to endure silently. You brought water. You adjusted the collar of his coat under pretense of tidying it, giving him a moment's cover to work his jaw subtly beneath your hands, easing the plates fractionally without the painter noticing anything beyond a valet's routine fussing. "Nearly done for today, sir," you murmured, low enough that only he could hear it, though you had no actual knowledge of how much longer the painter intended to work. It was, in its way, a small lie meant only to give him something to hold on to, a false horizon to aim his endurance toward, and you have told that same lie more times than you could count over the years, standing just close enough to offer a moment of false comfort to a man who could not, in front of witnesses, admit that comfort was something he needed at all. The finished portrait, when it was eventually unveiled months later at some gathering you weren't permitted to attend, was praised by everyone who saw it for its remarkable capture of the great man's calm resolve. You stood at the edge of the room that evening, refilling glasses, listening to guest after guest remark on the strength visible in that composed, unsmiling mouth, and you thought, though you said nothing, about the specific hours of grinding pain that particular expression had actually cost, and about how completely, how thoroughly, the finished image had erased every trace of what it had truly taken to produce it. You never mentioned that December night again, not directly, not in all the mornings that follow it, but you notice, cleaning the plates each evening, checking the gum each morning, that you have started paying attention not just to the small daily crises of his mouth, but to the larger rhythm of his whole body. The way his breath sounds when he climbs the stairs, the way his colour looks in different lights, the way his hands, once so steady holding a sword or a pen, have begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble slightly on the coldest mornings. This is the part of caring for someone you've come to understand that no one ever prepares you for. Not the specific tasks, the cleaning and fitting and powdering, all of which you mastered years ago through sheer repetition, but the slow accumulating weight of watching a body you know more intimately than almost anyone alive slowly, steadily lose ground against time, year after year, tooth after tooth, and understanding that your careful daily labour, however skilled, however practiced, is not actually stopping anything. It's only making the losing slightly more comfortable, slightly more dignified, buying small increments of ease against a battle that was always, from the very first morning you ever stood in that dressing room as a boy too small to lift the water jug properly, a battle that could only end one way. You have thought some nights about whether this makes the work meaningless or whether it makes it somehow more meaningful than any task that actually solved a problem permanently ever could. There is a particular dignity you have decided in tending carefully to something you know cannot be fixed, in showing up morning after morning, not because the outcome will change, but because the person living inside that failing body still deserves, every single day, the small mercy of being made as comfortable as careful hands can manage. You did not choose this work. No one asked whether you wanted to spend your life managing another man's decline. But you have found, somewhere in the middle of all those thousands of mornings, a version of purpose you did not expect to find in bondage, a private, unacknowledged pride in doing a hard thing well for someone who will never fully understand the cost of your doing it. You have never once said any of this aloud, not to Washington, not to Frank, not even, most nights, fully to yourself. It sits instead in the same quiet place where you keep the knowledge of the teeth, the memory of the December fear, the particular tenderness of your wife's hands working grease into your cracked knuckles by candlelight. Some understandings are simply too large, too complicated, too tangled up in a bondage neither of you chose, to ever be spoken plainly between two men bound together the way you and Washington have been bound together for the whole of your working life. You carry it instead the way you carry everything else in this house. Silently, steadily, one careful morning at a time. It is around this time, in the slow aftermath of that frightening December, that you begin, without either of you naming it directly, training a boy of perhaps 11 or 12 to shadow you through the mornings, a quiet acknowledgement neither of you speaks aloud that your own hands will not be available for this work forever, and that someone else will need to know the particular language of this specific mouth, this specific body, before that day arrives. The boy's name is Frank, quick-fingered and watchful, and you find him easier to teach than you expected, though watching him learn brings up feelings you hadn't quite prepared for. Something between pride and a grief you can't fully name. You show him first how to warm the water without letting it scald, testing the temperature against the inside of his wrist the way you were taught decades ago by the man who trained you, whose name you still remember, though he died years back now, buried in the same small plot behind the quarters where most of the household's dead eventually rest. You show Frank the small ivory-handled tools, letting him hold each one, feel its particular weight, understand before he ever uses one on an actual mouth exactly how much pressure it takes to clean without causing unnecessary pain. The first time you let him actually hold the brush against Washington's gum under your close supervision, his hand trembled visibly, and Washington, to your surprise, said nothing about the nervousness, simply held still and let the boy work through his own fear at his own pace, offering only a low, steady, "There, that's it," when Frank finally found the right pressure. You caught Washington's eye briefly over the boy's bent head in that moment, and something passed between the two of you that felt, for once, less like the usual master and servant distance, and more like two people who had both, in their own separate ways, spent years learning exactly this same delicate patience. You have to watch his eyes, you tell the boy one morning, standing just outside the dressing room door while Washington sleeps a little longer than usual, worn from yesterday's ride. Not just his mouth. His eyes tell you before his mouth does whether something's wrong. Frank nods, serious in the particular way children are serious when they sense they're being trusted with something that matters, and you feel, watching him absorb this, a strange doubling of time, as if you are simultaneously the boy you once were, learning this exact lesson from someone else's careful voice, and the old tired teacher you're apparently already becoming, decades sooner than you expected to become anything at all. You do not tell Frank, not yet, about the human teeth in the plate, about the ledger entry, about the particular weight of that specific knowledge. You decide, turning it over in your mind on the walk back to your own quarters that evening, that some lessons need to wait until a person is old enough and steady enough to carry them without the knowledge cracking something essential open inside. You carried that weight alone for years before you found any kind of peace with it. You're not yet ready to hand it to a boy of 12, however quick his fingers, however serious his eyes. What you do teach him over the following months is the simpler mechanics first, the temperature of the water, the correct pressure of the small brush, the particular way to angle a candle so its light falls exactly where the cleaning requires, without ever letting hot wax drip anywhere near Washington's face. Frank fumbles at first the way you fumbled once, dropping a tool, misjudging the water's warmth, and you find yourself correcting him, hearing your own long-dead teacher's voice come out of your mouth in places you didn't expect. The same patient corrections pass down now through a third pair of hands in a chain none of the men standing in that room ever fully chose for themselves. By the following spring, Frank can manage the morning cleaning almost entirely on his own, your presence there mostly to catch what he might still miss. A shrinking swelling he hasn't yet learned to read correctly, a plate seated a fraction crooked in its socket. You feel, watching him work with growing confidence, a strange mixture of pride and quiet grief. The particular ache of watching a skill you built over decades pass smoothly into someone else's younger, steadier hands. Proof that the work will continue long after your own hands have finally grown too tired to continue it themselves. The following years bring more of the same smaller crises and longer recoveries, and you settle back into the routine because the routine is what you have, what both of you have, the shared architecture of a relationship built entirely around maintenance and endurance rather than anything either of you would ever call affection out loud. Though you have come, over the decades, to recognize something in his voice when he says your name each morning that might, in another life, in another arrangement of the world, have been called that. You are aging too, though no one much notices a servant aging the way they notice a great man aging. Your own back has begun to ache by mid-afternoon most days, a dull, persistent complaint that settles deep in your lower spine after decades of bending over basins and dressing tables at exactly the wrong angle for your own comfort. Your eyes have grown less sharp than they once were, and you find yourself some mornings holding the small cleaning tools slightly farther from your face than you used to, squinting faintly in candlelight that never seems as bright now as it did when you were Frank's age, learning this work for the first time under someone else's patient guidance. Neither of you speaks of this parallel decline directly, the two of you growing old together inside the same careful architecture of dependency, though you sometimes catch him watching your hands during the morning cleaning with an attention that feels, on certain days, less like scrutiny of your technique and more like a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that time is working on both of you at once. However differently it has chosen to mark each of your bodies, you think some nights, walking back to your own quarters after the final evening cleaning, about all the mornings still ahead, and about all the mornings already behind you, and about the particular strange privilege and burden of being the one person alive who has seen George Washington entirely, completely, without any of the careful construction the rest of the world receives. The sunken face before the plates go in, the blood in the basin, the fear in his eyes on the worst nights, the small, private vanity of a man practicing a closed-mouth smile in front of a mirror he thought no one was watching. You carry all of it, the way you've carried the water jug, the way you've carried the wooden box with the brass clasp, the way you carry everything in this house that needs carrying and is never acknowledged as weight by anyone who benefits from you carrying it. This is the arrangement. This has always been the arrangement, long before you were old enough to understand what arrangement even meant, and it will remain the arrangement for as long as both of you are alive to maintain it. Morning after morning, one careful ritual at a time. Tonight, though, the house is quiet in the particular way it gets quiet in deep winter. Cold pressing against every window, fire banked low in every hearth, and you finish the last of your evening tasks and allow yourself, finally, the small luxury of stillness. The dressing room sits dark and orderly behind you, tools cleaned and put away, plates soaking in their dish of fresh water until morning, and somewhere down the hall, Washington's breathing, when you paused briefly to check on it before leaving, sounded steady. Sounded, for tonight at least, like a man who will wake again in a handful of hours and say your name in that thick, careful voice, and ask you to begin the whole careful architecture of the day all over again. You walk the familiar path back to your own quarters. In darkness you no longer need a candle to navigate. Past the kitchen where the last of the evening fire glows faint orange through the cracks in the hearth door. Past the room where the boy who polishes boots that will never be his own is already asleep on his pallet, curled small against the cold. The whole house breathes around you in its nighttime rhythm, wood settling, wind pressing at shutters, the distant murmur of the river continuing its endless, indifferent flow past a property that will outlive every single person currently sleeping within its walls. You think, on this particular walk, of your own children, grown now, some of them sold or hired out to other properties over the years, in arrangements you had no voice in choosing, scattered across a landscape you can trace on a map but rarely visit. You wonder, the way you wander most nights when your mind is tired enough to wander freely, whether any of them have learned a trade half as demanding as this one, whether any of them carry in their own hands some quieter version of the same careful patience you were taught by a man long dead now, patience passed down like a family inheritance nobody ever chose to receive, but that shaped every one of you regardless. Your wife is usually still awake when you reach your own quarters, mending by the light of a single stub of candle. She has learned to stretch across far more hours than it should reasonably burn, and she looks up when you come in, taking in, the way she always does, exactly how the day has gone by the set of your shoulders before you've said a single word about it. She has her own long day behind her too, work in the laundry that leaves her hands raw and reddened in a different way than yours. But she makes room for you at the small table anyway, and some nights, the harder nights, she takes your hands in hers without asking what happened, just holding them, working her thumbs gently across your knuckles until some of the day's tension finally eases out of them. "Bad one?" she asks tonight, and you nod, not trusting your voice to explain the specific weight of what today required. The swelling, the blood in the basin, the particular tiredness that comes from holding your face perfectly still and useful while someone else's pain plays out in front of you. She doesn't push for details. She has learned, over years of marriage to a man who spends his mornings inside another man's mouth, that some details are better left uncarried into this small room, this one space in the whole property that belongs, however tenuously, to the two of you and no one else. "Tomorrow will be easier," she says, though neither of you fully believes it, and there is comfort in the saying anyway, the same kind of comfort you offer Washington some mornings when you tell him the swelling looks better than it did yesterday. A small kindness extended not because it is strictly true, but because both of you need somewhere to rest your hope, however briefly, before the next day arrives to test it. Your own bed, when you reach it, is thin and hard, straw shifting under the worn blanket, but it is yours, in the only sense anything here can be called yours, and you lie down into it with the particular ache that comes from a full day of careful, precise, unacknowledged labour. Your hands smell faintly of tooth powder and pomade even now, hours after you last touched either. You doubt that smell will ever fully leave your skin, not after all these years, not after all these mornings of building a public man out of private ruin, with nothing more than your own 2 hands and whatever patience the day demands of you. Your back settles slowly into the thin mattress, each vertebra finding some small measure of relief after a day spent bent over basins and dressing tables, and your feet, sore from hours of standing on cold floorboards, throb faintly beneath the blanket in a way that will ease, you know from long experience, only after a good hour or more of stillness. You flex your fingers slowly under the blanket, feeling the small stiffness gathered in each knuckle, the accumulated wear of thousands of mornings spent guiding a small brush along someone else's ruined gums, and you let that stiffness ease bit by bit into the deeper, more forgiving ache of a body simply allowed, finally, to rest. Tomorrow will ask the same of you that today asked, and the day after that, and every day stretching out ahead into a future neither of you can fully see yet. The basin will need warming, the plates will need fitting, the powder will need puffing through what's left of his thinning hair. And somewhere in the middle of all that careful, repetitive labour, there will be a moment, small and unremarked, where the most powerful man in the young country sits still and vulnerable in a chair by the window, waiting for you, specifically you, to make him whole enough to face the world again. That is tomorrow's burden, though. Tonight there is only this, the thin blanket pulled up against the cold, the distant sound of the river continuing its patient work outside the walls, the particular hard-won stillness of a body finally allowed, however briefly, to simply exist without being asked to labour. Somewhere far off in a future neither of you will ever see, your own descendants will walk free through towns you cannot yet imagine, carrying names you gave them, or names given to them later by circumstances you cannot control from this thin bed in this cold attic room. You do not know this for certain tonight, lying here with your hands finally still, but you allow yourself, in the private dark, the small unguarded hope of it anyway, the way you allow yourself so few unguarded hopes in the ordinary run of your days. Centuries will pass, the house will become a museum, strangers will walk through the very dressing room where you spent so many careful mornings, pointing at a small wooden box behind glass, reading a placard that names the dentures and the ivory, and even, if the exhibit is honest enough, the fact that some of those teeth came from people enslaved on this very land. They will not know your name. They will not know your hands. But the routine you performed here, the quiet, unglamorous labour of maintaining a great man's fragile, failing body, will have shaped, in ways no history book fully credits, the very possibility of that great man ever standing steady enough in front of the world to become great at all. Some of those future visitors will pause a little longer at that particular glass case than at any of the grander rooms in the house. The study, the dining room, the wide porch overlooking the river, drawn by something they can't quite name in the small, strange intimacy of a dead man's teeth resting behind glass. A few of them, reading closely enough, will understand for the first time that greatness, whatever the word finally comes to mean, was never a thing one man built alone in any of the rooms of this house, but something built morning after morning by hands history mostly declined to record. Some things don't change. The ache in tired hands after a long day of careful work, the particular relief of finally lying down after hours of standing ready to be needed, the quiet dignity of doing a difficult thing well, even when no one who benefits from it will ever say your name out loud in the history that follows. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it takes every tired body at the end of a long day of labour, whatever labour that day demanded. Let the ache in your hands soften into the deeper ache of rest. Let the smell of tooth powder and pomade fade for a few hours at least from the edges of your awareness. Let the sound of the river outside blur into something closer to silence. You've earned this rest, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from, however many mornings still wait for you tomorrow. Take it, and dream of whatever dreams may come. Good night.